This is lecture 4, which is about the public management of animals and animal ethics, which are two related and I think really important topics for the subject and the premise of this course, which is our relationships with dogs. Particularly because dogs are domesticated animals and have sort of ongoing interaction with humans. There are all kinds of ethical questions that are raised about how we manage that set of relationships. So that's what we'll be talking about in this particular unit. One of the things that I think is really important about this unit is that it really, I think, puts all the subjects that we've been talking about in this course so far into context. So everything in this unit is really connected to everything that we've talked about so far. Starting with just sort of the idea that this is an interdisciplinary course, right? I mean, we're starting from the sort of the main position of how cultural anthropologists look at animals and dogs in particular, and particularly dog-human relationships. But we can't really talk about this subject effectively without looking at what other scholars in other fields think about and write about as well. So in this particular unit, in fact, you're not reading any anthropologists, you're reading a historian and then several philosophers. And, you know, both history and philosophy are fields that have influenced cultural anthropology a lot. There's a lot of overlap and a lot of sort of ongoing collaboration. So, you know, it's fitting, I think, that these are the two areas that are represented in this unit. So we're branching out a little bit from cultural anthropology, but again, still with that sort of anthropological eye on our topic. The other ways that I think this unit connects to our previous subjects are the following. I mean, first, the subject of dog origins, which we've talked about, sort of the evolution and domestication of dogs by humans and how that's sort of fundamental to both who dogs are and who people are. That fact that we've domesticated dogs goes directly to questions of ethics and the management of dogs, particularly in human society. Because we domesticated dogs, as you'll see in the readings, there's a sense that we have then an ongoing responsibility to dogs, right? That there's ethical questions raised by how we both individually and collectively take care of or don't take care of dogs, right? Essentially, we made dogs dependent on us through that process of domestication. And some would argue that that sort of leaves us with this ongoing sort of ethical responsibility to what happens to dogs. So we're definitely going to sort of reflect on that relationship. And then the third connection is, you know, in the last unit we talked about cross-cultural sort of approaches to dogs, what it means to be dog and how humans and dogs can and should interact. And again, there's a real connection to this unit. There's a relationship between those cultural models of what a dog is, particularly as we discussed sort of varying cultural assumptions about whether animalhood and personhood are sort of the same thing or different things, right? The degree to which dogs are treated as parallel beings to humans or as something radically different, right? We saw some variation in the examples we looked at. There are all kinds of ethical questions then that are built into those kinds of different cultural models, right? If we understand dogs to be selves, as we've talked about in the previous unit, right? Or if in some cultural contexts they are understood to be selves, to have their own sort of distinctive personhood, if you will, or doghood, then there are ethical questions about how we treat them, right? And what kinds of rights we do or don't extend to them. So again, I think this is just a really important unit and raises all kinds of really important and fascinating questions that go directly to all the topics that we've already addressed in the course. So let's go ahead then and dig into what these scholars have to tell us about these issues and how we can sort of, again, connect them back to some of the things we've been talking about. So the Wang article, Wang is a historian, and you know, again, it's got a little bit of a different flavor than the cultural anthropology that you've read, but there's all kinds of clear connections. And anthropologists are really interested in how things develop and change or stay the same over time. So there's a sort of an obvious connection to the work that historians do. This article, I think, is also interesting because it's a good example of how we can read an academic article for different things. What I mean is, in the context of being a U.S. historian, Wang's main argument really is about the development of politics and sort of the political sphere in the U.S. in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And that's interesting, for sure, to read about. But for the purposes of this course, what's more important is the example she's using, which is the development of basically animal control in U.S. cities during that era, right? So that bigger argument, right, is sort of not the most important thing for our purposes as we're interested in particular in the story of the dog in U.S. society, right? So we can read an article like this for a couple different things, right? So somebody interested more in writing about, say, the development of sort of political processes in the United States might read this for her more theoretical argument. For our purposes, we're going to read it for the details of this case of power struggles over animal control, particularly as regards dogs, but she talks about a variety of animals during that period of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, right? So the example that she's using is about sort of the rise of the ASPCA and the way that it interacted with the New York City Health Department around this issue of animal control, right? So it's a really interesting example because it starts to give us some historical context for things like the dog pounds that we know exist today, like where those sort of forms of animal control came from. And again, the ethical questions it raises or may raise are regarding how we have treated animals over time and how we do so today, right? Again, Wang's main sort of, from the perspective of history, main argument is really about the development of political life in the U.S. during this era. But the other sort of big theme, which I think goes directly to the stuff we're doing in this course, is she's also really talking about how the degree to which animals' presence in human society has informed many aspects of human social life, right? So including the development of political processes, and in this case, particularly the sort of intersection between public and private entities around policing aspects of human society, right? So dogs played a role in that, in how that developed. Okay, so digging in then to the specific case study that she's working on here. As she points out, the fact is in 19th century cities, which is where she starts this story, there were lots of animals around, right? There were not only dogs, but pigs and cows and horses and chickens, right, as she describes, often sort of roaming around and in the streets and whatever. There was much less of a sense at that moment in historical time of animals needing to be in a separate sphere than humans, right? But even in this era, loose dogs in cities, of which there were many, started to be perceived as a concern. They were perceived as a sign of sort of disorder or chaos in the streets, and also potentially as a health threat, right? This was particularly as it was coinciding with the rise of population density in U.S. cities, right? So as cities got bigger and more crowded, the question of the dogs that were running around in the streets became more pressing, right? And people started to be concerned about this in a way that they hadn't been before. Now, that concern intersected with another development at this moment in historical time, which was a different attitude, particularly towards dogs, right? So she talks about this sort of, these conflicting social developments, right? So the first is this sort of threat, particularly public health threat of dogs and animals, which coalesced around the fear that rabies would be something that would be transmitted, and that would be a reason to try to control dogs more, right? So in New York City, which is again the place where her case study is set, there was a development in this era of a system for catching those loose dogs, right, and trying to control them somewhat. And it developed and shifted over time. It started with bounty hunters who would get, some amount of money for bringing in stray dogs. The first dog pound was established in 1851. And there was a more sort of regular, sort of public municipal dog catching system developed in the 1870s, right? So during that latter half of the 19th century, we see a more regular approach to animal control, particularly around dogs, right? But here's where the conflict arises, because Wang reports that at the same moment, in this sort of, last half of the 19th century, there was developing, in terms of sort of social change, a family deal centered on the idea of the middle class home. And one piece of that was the idea of keeping animals as pets, right? So from a sort of shift from sort of dogs as sort of outdoor dogs or outdoor animals, right, that had sort of a separate sphere and separate lives from their humans, to the idea of sort of, for example, keeping a dog, right, a lap dog, who would be in the home with the family, with the children, right, and that was part of this ideal of sort of domesticity of the domestic family sphere. So that movement then was attached to a variety of other developments. One was the creation of the ASPCA, right? That was the first sort of animal welfare organization developed in the 1860s. There was a rise in things like animal cruelty laws and more activism around animal welfare. So by the end of the 19th century, this became sort of a recognizable movement, right? That there were lots more people aware of and speaking about the need to treat animals well, treat them in a certain way, right? So you have that conflict between this rise of animals as pets who need to be taken care of and sort of an animal welfare movement versus the increase in the interest in a city like New York City in being able to catch and control dogs who are perceived as a health threat, right? So that is one of the developments that Wang is really interested in. So the ASPCA also is rising in its sort of authority, right, around these questions of animal control, and in fact takes over catching dogs and sort of keeping dogs in dog pounds right near the end of the 19th century. So again, that's back to that main theme that Wang brings up of sort of the relationship between public and private power around animal control, right? Another development that sort of influences this story is the development of a rabies vaccine. Remember that a lot of the sort of concern about animals in cities, particularly dogs in cities, is this concern that people are going to get rabies from them, right? So the health department then, right, the public part of animal control, becomes more active around rabies prevention and control through now having access to a vaccine, right? So this sort of, again, rekindles this sort of conflict between the role of the ASPCA and the role of the health department, right? The health department, armed with their rabies vaccine, wants to take a stronger approach to controlling animals. Their main goal is to keep people healthy, right? That's their mandate. But some of the ways that they want to do that run afoul of the sort of animal welfare approach of the ASPCA. So things like a muzzling ordinance, like all dogs, being walked in public need to wear a muzzle. And even more radical things, like you read about the health department issuing a shoot to kill ordinance during a rabies outbreak, right? And ending up sort of killing some dogs that were pets owned by people, right? So again, that sort of more strong arm approach of the health department to trying to control rabies versus the rising animal welfare approach of ASPCA puts them in conflict, right? And again, it's a conflict about attitudes towards dogs. It's also just a conflict of sort of power and control, right, in the public sphere. Again, part of this is about that development of the ASPCA, the development of policing around dogs in cities, and part of it is around that shift. Ultimately, what Wang shows is that the control of animals in cities created this sort of blended public-private sort of power relationship, right? Where some of the authority was in the hands of public entities, some of the authority was in the hand of these private entities like the ASPCA, right? So it's an interesting element of the development of politics in the United States, and it's also an interesting example for us of some of the origins in this country, particularly in urban spaces, of the mechanisms and the structures by which dogs, particularly stray dogs, are controlled. So I think an interesting sort of background for us as we talk more again about the ethics around those ways that we control particularly stray animals. Okay, so the other two readings are much more into sort of the philosophy, right? So the ethical questions raised by how we treat animals, in particular dogs, is what we're focusing on, but it extends to other animals as well. And, you know, what the implications are of those ethics for what we do with dogs, right? So Palmer is speaking specifically about the ethical questions that arise around killing animals in shelters, right? This is sometimes referred to as euthanasia. I often refer to it as that myself, but as Palmer points out, actually, euthanasia is not really an accurate term for it, right? Euthanasia carries with it the assumption that it's for the best interest of the animal, right? And precisely what she's talking about here is questioning whether it really is in the animal's interest, right? So the question is, what are the ethical issues connected to our practice of killing healthy but unwanted animals who end up in shelters, right? A practice that we know is part of the shelter system in the U.S. You know, in the Chicago shelter, the Chicago Animal Care and Control, the city's dog pound, a certain percentage of the dogs who end up there are killed, right, when they can't be adopted, for example, right? So, what are the ethical questions that are raised by that practice, right? And she puts forward three different positions on this question, right? So again, we're not doing anthropology now, we're doing philosophy. And philosophers tend to want to argue out points very carefully and methodically, and understand what the different positions on an issue are and what the logic or lack of logic is connected to them. So that's what Palmer's approach is in this article, right? So she sketches out three different positions on this question, right? The first is a position that suggests that this is more of the sort of the position that might use the term euthanasia, right? In the sense that it suggests that, in fact, humanely killing animals in shelters is for their own good, essentially. It's in the service of the welfare of those animals, right? She gives this position this shorthand, which is pain, pain minimizing consequentialist. So the idea is, as long as you do it in a way that does not cause the animal suffering, right? Meaning you do, it's a humane process for killing the animal, that it's ultimately better than their lives of living in the streets, being unwanted, not having enough food, etc., right? So it's in their best interest and also in the best interest of human society for there not to be those unwanted animals about, okay? So that's position one. Position two is sort of at the other end of the spectrum, right? Which is sort of what she calls the animal rights position. And this position is that it's never okay to kill those animals in shelters, right? So that position suggests that animals have rights inherently, regardless of their relationships with people, all right? And the reason, the argument, right, or the sort of approach to this is that the reason that they have those rights inherently is because they are, quote, subjects of a life. That is, they have their own desires, they have their own perceptions of the world, etc. Again, connecting this to what we've already looked at in this course, you may note that that sounds very similar to what Cohn found working with the Runa people in the Amazon, as you recall, right? Like, that's exactly what their model was of dogs, that they have their own selves, right? That they have their dreams, that they, are pursuing certain things, etc. So this animal rights position, again, against killing animals in shelters, says these are subjects of a life. Therefore, they inherently have rights. And if we kill them, we are transgressing those rights, right? Part of that argument is that the issue of pain, right, which is the main criterion for argument number one, right, the pain minimizing consequentialist, pain is not the only issue here, right, according to the animal rights position. That in fact the dog's welfare is harmed in other ways, most notably by simply discontinuing their life, right? Like anything that they might have done in their lives is extinguished, right? And that's a form of harm. So it's not just whether it's painful to put the dog down, but there's other implications, right? And the sort of third piece of this position is the idea that even if one could argue that it's for the greater good to destroy these unwanted animals, that doesn't necessarily make it morally acceptable, right? So this is, again, this other end of the spectrum, the animal rights position, right? So having sketched out those two positions on this question, Palmer poses a third option, right? So she says, neither of these seems to really hit right for me. She says, here's another way to think about it. And that third position is what she calls a relational approach. So what she does then is to focus on the relationship between people and animals, or dogs and people, and suggest that that is where we need to look to understand what is ethically okay or ethically problematic about this practice of killing unwanted animals in shelters, okay? So, and this part of her argument goes directly to our early discussion about the domestication of dogs, right? Because what she says is that we domesticated dogs, right? Humans domesticated dogs. We sort of created them in the form that they exist. And part of what we did in creating domesticated dogs is to make them, to some extent, dependent on us, right? And the argument then is that because we are implicated in that process of creating these dependent domesticated animals, we have a sort of collective responsibility to deal with that, right? To take care of them. Like, we made them dependent, so we can't just then say, okay, you're on your own. Or if you get lost, then we'll put you down, right? So part of the argument then, this relational approach to this question, is the responsibility that is inherent in the fact that humans domesticated dogs, right? The flip side of it is that this relational approach also suggests that we need to as well respect a certain amount of independence in animals. So it's not just taking care of animals in light of their dependence, but also understanding that some dogs, for example, live independently, and that may be the better option for them, right? Part of this goes to that question of things like street dogs, right? And you're seeing a film about street dogs, in fact, that speaks exactly to this issue, right? If dogs can live relatively well, right, meaning there's access to the resources that they need, they're not in pain, they're not being attacked, right, they have access to food, etc., then do we also have an ethical obligation to allow them to do that, right? So this relational approach sort of looks at both sides of that. And ultimately what Palmer wants to do is really challenge how we understand human-pet relationships, right? And to reveal that for the most part, humans dominate animals. And in most of our dealings with animals, particularly dogs, we treat them as a means to another end. So there's a sort of instrumentalist approach, right? And she suggests, ethically speaking, we need to not do that, right? One example that she ends with is the idea that the push to spay and neuter animals is premised on a sort of thinking that is the same attitude that is used for justifying killing animals in shelters. And again, she's not necessarily arguing that we shouldn't spay or neuter animals, or we shouldn't kill animals in shelters, but she's sort of arguing what the ethical implications of those things are. And again, the argument is that we're treating animals as a means to another end, right? As being about what their significance is for humans and for human society. And if we really want to take the ethics of these questions seriously, we need to understand the dogs as distinct beings, right, with their potentially their own rights to either live in a domestic setting or not, and that these decisions don't reflect the well-being, or in fact the sort of the selves of those dogs. So again, she's sketching out these three positions really just to think through all the implications of the question, not necessarily to land on one position or another. This photo, incidentally, is from a dog shelter in Costa Rica, where hundreds of stray animals are allowed to sort of have free run of the place. So it's a different approach to shelters. I thought it was interesting, just sort of in keeping with the kind of conversation that Palmer is raising about both our responsibilities to animals and the need to take seriously questions about their freedom to do different kinds of things. Okay, and the last piece that you read, also again by philosophers, thinking about sort of the ethical questions around our treatment of domestic animals, in particular dogs, in the case of what we're thinking about, is Kymlicka and Donaldson. And they're really arguing that it's just and appropriate to extend citizenship to domestic animals. So they're starting from the premise that animals have basic rights because they are sentient beings, right? Again, with echoes of some of the stuff we've already talked about, that animals don't just have rights because they're in relationship to humans, but in and of themselves, they're sentient beings. They have basic rights, right? And the way they frame what those rights look like is that they say that domestic animals are part of human society, right? They share society with humans. So they should be afforded membership in that society. So they use this concept of citizenship. So drawing here on sort of political theory to understand what the sort of the rights of animals should look like within human society. They extend that idea of using these sort of political theory concepts to understand those relationships. They say if domesticated animals should be afforded citizenship, wild animals should be afforded sovereignty, right? Sort of a separate sphere where they can have control over their lives. And then liminal animals, which they are talking about as like urban animals, things like squirrels, should have sort of a right to residency, right? So neither citizenship, right, as a domestic animal, nor sovereignty as truly wild animals, but something sort of in between. So what they're doing then in this article is sort of sketching out what that means, right, to afford citizenship to domesticated animals. And they take on a couple of arguments against it, and sort of, again, not unlike the Palmer article, it's the same sort of approach, talking about different positions on the issue, and then, sort of arguing through whether that's a valid position or not. So citizenship as a concept, as they describe, is about both rights and responsibilities. So there's a certain degree to which we're talking about protections for animals, and also a certain degree to which it's about their participation in society. And it rests on a notion of inclusivity, right? That's sort of what citizenship as a concept entails. So then they look at, again, a couple of arguments against, and they try to sort of knock those down or talk about another way of thinking about it. So the first argument that they pose, or that they know has been directed at this approach of citizenship for domesticated animals, is that citizenship would actually be bad for animals, because it would be about policing and controlling those animals. And animals are vulnerable to a certain extent because they're dependent and they can't fully express themselves. So that this citizenship would depend on humans, right? So it would put them in a somewhat, again, vulnerable position. So the way that Kymlicka and Donaldson respond to that is that they say it is true that a citizenship model would require finding more and better ways to understand what animals want, right? So communication, being able to perceive animals' desires more carefully would be something that would need to happen. And also that it would require understanding that animals might want different levels of inclusion in human society, right? So sort of like Palmer argued, that there may be contexts in which letting animals not be fully integrated into human society might be the ethically appropriate position, right? So the second argument against this idea of citizenship for domesticated animals is that it would actually be bad for democracy, right? So the first argument is it's bad for the animals. The second is it's bad for the system, right, for the democratic system. So bad for the sort of concept of citizenship. And as they point out, this notion that it would be bad for democracy rests on all kinds of assumptions about democracy that they say are false, right? So the idea that democracy requires capacity for reason, for self-control, for communication, for socialization, right? First of all, they point out that domesticated animals are able to do all those things, right? For example, dogs who, spend a lot of time around humans learn how to act in appropriate ways, or are taught how to act in appropriate ways by the humans that they're around, right? And further, they suggest some of those sort of reasons for excluding or potentially excluding domestic animals from democratic processes or from citizenship would also end up excluding many humans, right? That citizenship, again, rests on a notion of inclusivity. And that includes all kinds of humans as well as potentially domesticated animals. So they're, again, challenging the reasoning here embedded in this position. The final point they make is that, this focus on democracy being premised on reason and deliberation, the fact is that that doesn't always lead to justice anyway. So again, they're sort of knocking down this argument in favor of thinking about how to extend this notion of citizenship to include non-human animals, particularly domesticated animals. And they end with sort of this idea, right? So this is a quote from the article. We need to think of citizenship as a way of interacting with all of those who share our society in all of their diversity. Citizenship is about treating co-citizens as full and equal members of a shared society, supporting and fostering their flourishing and their opportunities for cooperation and participation in ways that are meaningful and possible for them. And having rightly committed ourselves to inclusive citizenship in this sense in relation to human diversity, we can hardly exclude domesticated animals, that's what DAs are, on the grounds that they do not fit an image of the model citizen. Humans do not fit. So again, they're saying if we're going to be, as we should be, around all kinds of different people being afforded this membership in human society, then it's only fitting that we would do so with the domestic animals that are also part of our everyday lives. So we'll stop it there. Again, lots of really, I think, pressing ethical issues raised by these different scholars that are really central to how we think about the relationships between dogs and people. We'll talk again soon. Bye-bye.